I have about half an hour before the girls go to bed, and then I talk to my mother in Australia. So the nature of these girls has been dividing up my time into time where I can work on books, work on my regular workaday job, work on podcasts, and then just look after them, and occasionally do basic bits of upkeep with regards to my own life and the life of my wife, who is long suffering through all these projects. I was hoping this morning for my friend John Rogers. I call him my friend. He's a YouTuber slash filmmaker slash former, I don't know, I can't even remember the guy's name currently. No. Where the name is, there's another name which I know is not the right. Russell Brand. It's the gentleman's name. He used to work for Russell Brand back in the day. Anyway, so my relationship with John Rogers' videos became a fiduciary Patreon relationship with John Rogers' videos through the start of the pandemic, because I watched his videos prior to the start of the pandemic, but through the pandemic I just found his videos incredibly cathartic, or at least the start of the pandemic, and it showed a human still somehow able to go for long, detailed walks through London, which was completely and utterly, clearly part of my earlier times in terms of visiting, but not able to through the pandemic. So John Rogers once mentioned another YouTube video series called Cruising the Cut, which was about canal boating. And although the narrative associated with these canal boat videos is I started watching maybe half a dozen to a dozen of these content creators on YouTube as they nominally cruised around the canals of England. And this became a large part of the pandemic for me as well, watching these people. And then slowly but surely I started adding some of them on Patreon, and I started getting very disconcerted with regards to the whole narrating community. But certainly at the start of the pandemic, and maybe even historically, like literally as I was going to plug the microphone in to record this podcast, I thought it's probably worth saying that I still imagine in some dream state 20 years in the future, maybe even 18 years in the future, that I'm able to own a narrowboat and cruise the canals of England, which I probably couldn't be able to do. I mean, I might be able to financially at that stage, but I just find the whole nature of canal boating was sold to me as a lifestyle through a pandemic, which I couldn't escape from. And I bought a series of books associated with canal boating, associated with the canals, because obviously they have like a road map, unlike the roads, but with actually canals. And this whole lifestyle of being on this boat, puttering around at about 5 miles an hour at most, usually more like 2 miles an hour, through the English countryside just struck me as an amazing lifestyle when I was in complete lockdown. And I think in reflection, probably the more that people look into this lockdown psychology, the more people will equate it just to pure madness, unadulterated madness. I mean, literally, I find the boxes that I somehow packed through lockdown and look at the stuff that I had amassed through it, and it really is a very strange footnote on my humanity and my existence. I mean, the nature of the miniature painting, which I don't talk about in this podcast, but in the My Rules Are Better podcast, you might hear more about that. That also evolved through the pandemic, and really the whole function of the pandemic had elements that were, related to miniature painting and the pandemic and these things. So I was able to get certain hobbies and certain mindsets through the pandemic, which were fundamentally, at the time at least, cathartic, but then, in the case of narrowboating, really became incredibly toxic. I followed a bunch of narrowboaters until they stopped narrowboating. A majority, really there's only one narrowboater who I still follow, who at the time, through the pandemic, I had paid through Patreon and never got any shout-out acknowledgement that you're supposed to get, but this whole thing was a scam. Stopped paying him the Patreon, and then 6 months after, well, literally probably about 3 months ago, he finally acknowledged me in one of his videos. I was like, well, I probably should put him back on my Patreon, so he's back on my Patreon. But almost all the narrowboaters went through this period of about 2 years where they were just loving narrowboating, and then they all stopped. And what concerned me more than anything was the honesty that I got from some of them indicated that there was like violence on the canals. Like, people had moved to the canals, obviously, through the COVID period because you got slightly better movement requirements than you did under house-restricted COVID. But at the same point, most of them got COVID as well on the canal boats. So these people have this amazing, like, the canal is beautiful and picturesque and all this kind of stuff, but at the same time, mysteriously they all stopped it and bought houses and just moved off the canal boat thing. Some of them maintain Patreons, some of them I still keep Patreons with because I, think the stuff they're doing is interesting. There was a couple called Foxes Afloat who were two guys who, a lot of gay folk in the narrowboating community for a start. I think that is a podcast in and of itself. But anyway, these two guys I think are genuinely interesting, although one of them is suicidal quite dramatically. So you've got this kind of curious juxtaposition. The guy who did Cruising the Cut, which was the original one, was an ITV newscaster. So he has like a newscaster persona to him. He survived on the narrowboat for maybe 3 years, then decided for a year he wasn't going to do any cruising, and then he did the mathematics and realized he couldn't actually afford a house unless he got off the narrowboat now, and he just had to cancel the whole narrowboat thing. So their passion for narrowboating comes through the videos, but doesn't actually extend to their real life. And to be perfectly frank, I understand why this narrowboating thing clearly was like a religion. But many of us, I have a coworker actually, who also watched the narrowboating stuff because Prime, the Amazon video service, picked up a couple of these narrowboaters. BBC picked up Robbie Cummings, who's one of the few narrowboaters who I still actively support. And then you have, what are they called, Chugging Along, who are, I think, maybe historically supported, or maybe just, I don't know. Maybe I still do, I don't know. But they produced a board game, which, these narrowboaters, like, so there was a couple, a lesbian couple, who wanted to start teaching people art remotely online, and that became the direction of their vlog. It's no longer about the narrowboating. They were on the narrowboat for a couple of years. They went to actually sell the narrowboat recently, quite publicly. Everything had to be done publicly. They were the ones I got frustrated with the most initially, because they were the ones that I attended. They had these Q&A sessions where you drop by some Google video hangout thing, and they basically just talked with a single guy for the entire 90-odd minutes, and I sat through it, and I had a slight question about how, narrowboats age over time and these kind of things, but they weren't even getting to that. They were talking with this guy in Tennessee who has a Tennessee whiskey collection. So my frustration level got to various levels with various of them, and thankfully I think Cruising the Cut at least I maintained for a while, and then when I realised he wasn't doing the weekly, might have been a weekly vlog, I think it was a weekly vlog where he cruised around the canal system, and he only went to a small number of the canals. There was a group called the Minimalist Podcast, or whatever, Minimalist Video Cast, and they were an American guy and a very particular British woman travelling around all the canals. They went to all the canals, at least, that you could go to in England and Wales, and, they went to the Yorkshire canals, and these canals, that the ones that interested me that no one ever seemed to go on. So they were pretty interesting, but then they stopped canal boating, and they started renovating their canal boat and these kind of things. So the violence on the canal system was something that really fascinated me, though, because things turned sour pretty quickly for a number of the narrowboaters. There's also like a 14, 15-year-old girl who basically is talking vicariously through her mother, which is just it became clear there was this panhandling and child abuse at some level. So, the canal boat community, as it portrayed itself, at least on YouTube, and look, there are still half a dozen canal boaters that occasionally come in my feed. There's a fellow who really is very curious, is a kind of stationary canal boater. He lives in one of these canal boating facilities where a bunch of canal boaters are all moored up. And he went through his early videos of him basically sexually assaulting I shouldn't laugh at this, it's true. Basically sexually assaulting a woman who then has nothing more to do with him. And then about a year and a half later, he has this other woman who he's been able to manhandle into being on his vlogs. And these characters just are there. So Robbie Cummings is an interesting one because he's one who's slightly younger. He's gone through maybe 3 or 4 girlfriends through the period. They're very much kind of like soap operas in some regard on canal boats in England. I think that's probably the best way to frame it. And, the Cruising the Cut guy had a on and again, off again female interest who starts doing her own videos and now has her own men in the videos. And she got COVID too. I think a majority of actually got COVID. So I now have a section of my wall of books, which is canal boating, and I even have a small box, which is additional canal boating books that I haven't yet been able to get into my wall. And my anticipation is sometime in the future, I might actually get on a canal boat for a holiday or something like that. So I don't really want to get rid of all of them, but they represent this curious id. So I've got, for example, Canals and Britain, a large, I think it's a softcover book, but it's still a large book. And I've got half a dozen of these kind of books associated with canal boating, the liveaboard canal boating, life aboard a narrowboat, all this kind of stuff. So this is part of my psychology, which is purely COVID related. And maybe in the future, you never know. I mean, it would take a very different life trajectory than I've found myself in. The single man canal boaters, see a previous guy and allegations of assault on this particular podcast for more. The single men narrowboaters that have just gotten a divorce and end up on a narrowboat, there are a few of those, they didn't last very long, let's just say that. So it really seems to be a pretty transient and somewhat curious community. I'm sure in Pensty, I watched a husband and wife couple, fancy that, for a period of time, and they explicitly, in communication with me, talked about the nature of the anger. The 14, 15-year-old girl does this as well, that they're just constantly berated by noise from these other narrowboaters. I mean, you've got to appreciate this is a thing that you move for many of them only 3 hours a day. Move along how many miles you make in 3 hours, which is usually about 3 miles. You then moor up on the side of a bank and have a bunch of other narrowboaters who may or may not respect you around you immediately mooring up. So finding moorings where there aren't other narrowboaters seems to be one of the, and moreover, mooring, and anyway, the proximity of other people around you isn't really that removed. It's not like living in the middle of nowhere. It's like living next to a bunch of other people that are also narrowboaters. It seems to be a very curious community. Also, the annual narrowboating fairs that they have in England, and the fact that they have ancient narrowboats that are controlled by people that can't control them and ram other narrowboats and things like that. I mean, it is a very interesting community once you start having a window into it. But the window into the narrowboat community is represented by books, which I have, and I'm wondering what to do with. I think I'll just end up with a narrowboating section of my particular shelves and work out what I'm going to do with that when it happens. But like I say, I had a John Rogers video or narrowboating, opted for talking about narrowboating in the podcast, which I promised to do. And hopefully this makes some sense. It's going to be probably a blessing to audio edit this thing. I am working on a couple of books currently. The Sea Lion book is ticking along. And I'm also working on a My Rules Are Better special Just Plain Chaos book, which actually has quite an interesting introduction that I've just narrowly finished now. So this is my time when I'm not being a father, taking bits of book out of little girls' mouths and instructing them how to eat snacks wherever possible, these kind of things. So Tom Barbalet in Las Vegas, Nevada, signing out.